In February 1924, a filthy beggar woman stood on a frozen road and looked at the golden roofs of Lhasa. Her face was smeared with soot and Chinese ink. Her hair was lengthened with black yak hair, braided with cheap coral. She was 55 years old and French. She had walked for 4 months to stand there. Any Tibetan official who looked closely could end her journey in an afternoon. Alexandra David-Néel had already crossed passes near 19,000 feet to reach that valley. So how did she walk into the most closely watched city in Asia? And what finally gave her away? Tibet had spent decades learning to fear men with maps. British and Russian agents had surveyed its passes, and in 1904, a British column shot its way toward Lhasa. After that, Tibet answered every foreigner with the same word: no. Permits were refused, frontiers were watched, and travelers were turned back after months of walking. That refusal shaped everything about the plan Alexandra David-Néel was building. If no European could enter Lhasa, then no European would. Only 2 pilgrims would go, and one of them would be invisible. She had not begun as an explorer. She sang opera in Hanoi and Athens, and she read Buddhist texts in the reading rooms of Paris. She married the railway engineer Philippe Nayel, then left him in 1911 for a study trip that lasted 14 years. He sent her money for years, and she sent him hundreds of letters from the mountains. In 1912, in the hill town of Kalimpong, she was granted an audience with the 13th Dalai Lama, then living in exile. He asked how a European woman had come so far alone, and told her to learn Tibetan. She obeyed for the next 12 years. Her story proves something uncomfortable about discovery. Forbidden places are not taken by force or funding, but by patience, and by the willingness to become nobody. In 1914, she climbed into a cave above the snow line in northern Sikkim, near 13,000 feet. She lived there through 2 winters with a hermit teacher, Gomchen of Lachen. Her supplies were barley flour, brick tea, and butter, hauled up the slope by villagers. At night, the ink froze in her writing case. There she practiced the breathing discipline Tibetans call tumo, said to raise the body's heat from within. She also met Afur Yongden, a Sikkimese boy of 15 who became her guide, and later her adopted son. In 1916, she crossed the frontier without permission, reached Shigatse, and visited the Panchen Lama. When British officials learned of it, they expelled her from Sikkim within weeks. She lost her cave, her teacher, and her permit in a single stroke. Instead of sailing home, she turned east and took the longest road on Earth. For 7 years, she moved through Japan, Korea, and a China breaking apart under warlords. In 1918, she reached Kumbum, a great monastery in the eastern grasslands, and stayed almost 3 years. There, she and Yongden copied and translated old texts by lamplight, in rooms that smelled of butter smoke. Kumbum gave her the last things she needed: the accent, the manners, and the prayers of a Tibetan pilgrim. If journeys into closed worlds and human limits hold you, consider subscribing to Wonders and Frontiers. In October 1923, they walked out of Kumbum at night, hidden inside a small caravan. Days later, she dismissed the servants and the pack animals, and everything changed. 2 people remained on the road, carrying a tent, flour, and a pistol under sheepskin. She burned or buried anything a beggar could not own. From that hour, she was an old pilgrim mother, traveling with her son toward the holy city. Ahead lay 2,000 kilometers of frozen highland, with no permits and no rescue. The first test came in a farmhouse in the borderlands. Villagers invited the 2 pilgrims to sit by the fire, and the light fell on her hands. Her hands were pale, and a woman leaned forward to look. Yongden said his mother had been ill for months and could not speak. They walked out before dawn, and she never sat close to an open fire again. This was the answer forming to the question of how a European crossed Tibet unseen. She was not hiding her face so much as hiding her rank. In December, they climbed toward a pass above 18,000 feet, with snow already falling. By evening, the snow was waist deep, and there was no fuel and no shelter. Yongden's boots froze solid on his feet. She wrote that she sat down in the drift and practiced tumo until her body burned. That account comes only from her own writing, and it has never been independently verified. What is known is that both of them walked over the pass in the morning. Their tent canvas cracked like wood when they folded it. The worst danger was not the cold, but the district of Po, feared even by Tibetans. Its people had a reputation for robbing pilgrims and leaving no witnesses. One evening, armed men followed them along a river gorge for hours. Yongden turned and greeted them loudly as fellow travelers, then offered to share tea. Some accounts suggest that confidence was what saved them, because robbers expect fear. The men drifted away in the dark, and the two pilgrims walked all night without stopping. There were nights when they slept sitting up, because lying down left tracks near villages. Once she boiled a strip of leather cut from her own bag and drank the broth. Once they crossed a gorge on a bridge of twisted hide, one strand at a time. 4 months in, the question was no longer whether she could reach Lhasa, but what it would cost. Her feet were ruined, her flower was nearly gone, and the golden roofs were still 4 days away. Then, on a cold February afternoon, the valley opened. The Potala stood on its rock above the plain, its gilded roofs burning in thin sunlight. She stopped in the road. She had waited more than 40 years for that shape. She wanted to shout, she wrote, and instead she said nothing at all. Yongden reminded her that beggars do not stare at palaces. They walked into Lhasa among thousands of pilgrims arriving for the Great New Year festival. Nobody stopped them. Nobody looked twice at an old woman in a greasy sheepskin. That was the strangest part of the victory. It was completely silent. For 2 months, she lived inside the Forbidden City, sleeping in cheap lodgings. She climbed the stairs of the Potala, with her hands folded like any other pilgrim. She watched masked dances, butter sculptures, and long processions of monks in the winter light. She took notes in secret, in a script she had spent 12 years learning, and what finally gave her away was her own decision. In May 1924, she walked into Gyantse and presented herself to David MacDonald, the British trade agent. She needed a witness, because she knew that without one, nobody in Europe would believe her. MacDonald's family fed her, the British authorities complained about her, and the secret was over. Many people doubted her anyway. Skeptics point out that a few European men had entered Lhasa before her, and she never claimed otherwise. Her claim was smaller and stranger, that she had walked in as a Tibetan beggar and lived there unnoticed. My Journey to Lhasa appeared in 1927 and has never left print. Yongden died in 1955, and she mourned him as a son. She kept writing until her death in 1969, at the age of 100. Here is the reversal she never escaped. The woman who reached Lhasa by becoming nobody spent the rest of her life as a famous name. She could never be invisible again, and she never saw Tibet again. Somewhere on that frozen road in the winter of 1924, guards looked straight at an old beggar and saw nothing worth stopping. For more journeys into closed worlds and the people who found a way inside, stay with Wonders and Frontiers.